Hey guys, nice to see you again, such as I'm seeing you. I see over the past few days that a number of questions have come up regarding the religious beliefs of within the Upanishads and within the Brahmanic Hindu tradition in general. And how is it that you can reconcile, on one hand, this idea of Brahman, of the absolute, of the one without a second, of all these things that we see in some of the Upanishads, with what is quite clearly a polytheism in certain situations. I mean, you have the king of death, Nachiketa, you have Indra, the king of the gods, you have all these different gods, and in other places you have references simply to God. In Svetasvatara, for instance, you have a reference to God. How do you reconcile the polytheism, the monotheism, and the monism, the oneism, or really what is more properly called non-dualism, Advaita? How do you reconcile all three of these things in the Upanishads? How do you make sense out of this? Well, I think one of the best ways to approach it is to begin by asking, what exactly does it mean to believe in something, and in a religious sense, in general, and certainly specifically here within the Upanishads? This is a tricky question because I'm not entirely sure it has a simple answer. A lot of people will say, well, I believe in God, or I believe in Jesus, or I believe in this religious set of practices, or this religious object, or whatever it happens to be. And if you ask them what they mean by that, they say, well, I believe that it's true. I believe that it's the case, that it does what it does. So I believe Jesus is the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end, or something like this. And this is what we talk about with creeds. But there's a sense in which, even if you do accept that as true, it's still a very vague concept. I mean, it's not as though that really, in saying that, that really answers the question that's asked, or all the material that's within the question that's asked. When we talk about believing in something, I think we're talking about something much more than that. We're talking about an investment in a certain way, an investment of faith, of will, of what you would take to be the case. And if you think about believing in, if for lack of a better word, in that sense, you might be a little closer to the road to reconciliation of the polytheism, of the monotheism, and of the non-duality that's in all of this. Here's what I mean. If you take believing in, so say believing in these gods, as this investment of faith and will, one of the things you can see that happens within this, even in the very earliest of the Upanishads, is that there's a certain quality that believing in the gods does. And what it does is it allows you to begin to draw in and to focus your will, your attention towards a particular thing. You got to remember the central problem that we're looking at within the Upanishads and within the sort of Brahmanic worldview. The problem is this problem of finitude, the problem of ignorance, and then the suffering, of course, that comes from all of this. Remember, there's this sense that we attach to one thing, and then the next thing, and the next thing, and the next thing. We're distracted, we're excited, we're depressed, we move up, we move down, we go all over the place in all these different things and take these things in all these different ways. And it divides us so that our consciousness and our capacity to be what we are, to be in the world, to be pure and free and centered, all of that is sort of cast like seeds to the wind, right? It's just very, very difficult for us to fully be what we are. But with the idea of gods and devotion to these gods, the term in Sanskrit is bhakti, devotion. To focus on a god, to have some way in which we consider to it, in which we pray to it, in which we hold it to be the case, in which it centers in our mind. This becomes, in some sense, almost a discipline by which we begin to reign in these aspects of ourself. Now, you might say, well, okay, but are they really doing that? Actually, the word in Sanskrit for God, the generic word for Sanskrit, for God in Sanskrit is deva. And the root for that has to do with the senses itself. It's related to the word darsh in Sanskrit, which means to see or to gaze upon something. So that there's a way in which the gods are not just these quote-unquote higher powers or super things. Really, they're more like those central essences, those objects around us that we can focus in upon. And when we focus rightly, when we concentrate our energies, our will, our love, our devotion, our way of being, when we focus in, we rein ourselves in and bring the possibility of a more clear expression to us. In other words, believing in a God, and specifically prayer to a God, isn't just holding that it is or isn't a part of the physical universe. Perhaps it is, and perhaps it isn't. But that's almost irrelevant. What's relevant is that it is an object for our focus. Now, the same thing holds for the idea of God just as God, of the Lord. The term for the Lord in Sanskrit is Ishvara. You see that referred to sometimes in this. And you certainly see it referred to in the tradition a lot. And you might say, well, how can they have all these different gods and God, like we talk about God in the Bible God? Well, it's because God usually is thought about in terms of what they call Saguna Brahman. Brahman in terms of qualities. So that it's thinking about this principle of absolute, but again, in the sense of having something to focus on. Not physically, but conceptually. The idea that we can have a God, a point, a focal object for our mind, for our will, for our soul, for a sense of how we would regard and reflect upon ourselves, upon our true nature in being what we are in the world. This is what the role of God, of Saguna Brahman is, right? It's not exactly that it's a fact. Again, it's an object for us. Now, this brings me to the last point, maybe the most important point that sort of brings this all together in some sense. You might say, well, okay, that's great, having gods as being focal points for our devotion and helping us clarify ourselves and become more aware of the true self and consciousness with regard to that. And that's great that God, as God, plays the same role as well. But isn't that just sort of making God an aspect of the self? Isn't that just making God, the idea of God or gods, kind of a tool? And my answer to that would be, well, in a manner of speaking, yes, but that's not at all inappropriate. Because remember what this all comes down to. Non-duality, one without a second. What is the true self? It's not something inside of here. It's something that is Brahman. It is the equivalent, right? Atman is Brahman. Remember Chandogya Upanishad. Svetaketu is asking, what are you? You are that, right? This is what his teacher tells him. When he tells him that, he's not just trying to associate him with things. He's trying to help him recognize this common underlying condition. The true self isn't you, it isn't me. It is the very possibility that there is anything at all. It is the is of isness. Now, if you take that way of thinking about self, and you say, well, all these different gods, they're simply done for the sake of the self clarifying its self to itself. I know there's a lot of selves there, but the self clarifying itself to itself, then this isn't really a problem at all. As a matter of fact, if you think through that, it really couldn't be any other way. Of course, gods and God are part of the self. How could it ever be any different? This is the nature. This is why religion and devotion become so important. They, in turn, are, to use the term within the Sanskrit, they are yogas. They are exercises. They are ways, just like philosophy, just like action, just like morality, just like achievement, just like all the different things that we try to do. They are ways of coming to realize what the nature of reality is, what the nature of self is, and from that undo the ignorance that gives rise to this oh so unnecessary and yet oh so ubiquitous problem of suffering. So there you go.